As you were saying.
Zachary, sorry.
No, you're just fine. You're just fine. As we're kind of concluding, I'd like to share a story, an anecdote that's similar to what Stephen was talking about, but it actually had to do with This may or may not be a good idea, but I go up to the conference center during general conference, and I'll sometimes talk to the protesters standing outside. And this most recent time that I went, I was talking with an evangelical about some of these different topics. And I could tell that, I certainly don't want to like impose this on everyone. He was rather abrasive with me, and he was.
I am shocked.
Yeah,
that protesters would be abrasive.
Yeah,
but as I was talking,
the signs are always so welcoming and friendly.
And rational.
And
well spelled.
Yeah.
Yes, with minimal grammatical mistakes.
Yes.
So you go to the conference center sometimes.
Yes, I'll go to the conference center and I'll talk to protesters standing outside. And some of them are really, really cordial, and some of them are very friendly, and then some of them are very not. So one of my favorite insults I've ever received is, "I'm the devil's sock puppet." And it was just so funny to me, but but a lot of this goes to show that a lot of the time there can be some really harsh feelings between Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints regarding a lot of these topics, because I mean they care about it and we care about it.
Right.
And the goal of this specific discussion, this panel, isn't necessarily to provide all the ammunition to proof text everybody who disagrees with us into the ground. I don't think that's the main goal here. The idea, and I think it's really outlined in your podcast in particular, is that we want to be able to discuss these things more effectively and in ways that tend to be more constructive.
You can find that podcast on the FAIR channel, on the FAIR YouTube. It's from 2 years ago when we did
New Testament
year.
Well, and on that note of actually engaging with people, which I encourage everybody to do, I think it's
don't engage.
It's really,
especially the curmudgeon here.
I think that well, I know you're being cynical, but I think it's really important to engage people who disagree with you. I mean, one of the kind of the memes or jokes that's passed around the internet is the idea of an echo chamber. You don't want to find yourself in an echo chamber, and I think that everybody can, to some degree, fill themselves with groups of people who just agree with them, and that sounds comfortable. Not for me, because I'm a terrible person, but but when you engage with people, what's really stopping, I think, some Latter-day Saints is this feeling of inadequacy when they do it. And I'm going to give my 2 cents, get on my soapbox for a second, because what's really important is, in our faith tradition, we are often told that bearing a testimony is sufficient for conversion. The problem with it is we're also taught to teach by the Spirit, to search and study and pray and fast and read the scriptures and study. So one of the things that I think we often miss is that the function of the Holy Ghost is not to give you information you don't have and that you've never done. And so one of the things that Christ taught in the biblical text is this idea of he will bring all things to your remembrance whatsoever I've said to you. And that is a passage that has stuck with me my whole life. And while I was serving my own mission, I would often find myself in situations where something that I had read would pop into my head. And the way that I kind of analogize that is I say, look, your brain is a filing cabinet. Sometimes it's many filing cabinets. Sometimes it's a very small shoebox filled with a couple of papers. And depending on how well you build the filing cabinet, putting the information in there, the Holy Ghost function is to pull it out when you need it. And for me, I'm not an overly emotional person. And one of the ways I feel the Spirit is when something is brought to my recollection at a time when I need it. And so the more you have, the more confident you'll be. But also, too, actually getting engaged. And I'm glad you do that, Zach. I'm glad you do talk to people that disagree with you, because it's important, because it helps you to learn how they speak, to get through some of these things. One of the things that I've noticed is sometimes people will have not only just vocabulary, but will use a word in Latter-day Saint parlance. And there's a great talk by Boyd K. Packer where he talks about, it's called the light of Christ, if I recall it correctly. And he makes a distinction between the Holy Ghost as a member of the Godhead and the Spirit the light of Christ, and their functions. One of them is a personage, one of them is a thing. And that is something that Latter-day Saints would say the Spirit. But it means two things. Latter-day Saints have a more complex theology in many of these instances because of our ongoing revelation, because of our current expansive canon, because we have clarity where it's you have an apostle who comes and says, look, Spirit and Spirit are used interchangeably often, but they mean two things depending on context. You've got the person of the Holy Ghost, and you've got the thing of the Spirit that is actually working among us, kind of like a water. If you're in the water, we often say, we're in the water and we're not aware of it, kind of a thing when it comes to Spirit. But it's really important to recognize that the Holy Ghost can do nothing in most circumstances because he's not going to give you knowledge that you could read in a book. You can go get it. Go before you go and engage these people, read, study, learn, fill your filing cabinet with knowledge so the Holy Ghost has something to work with. And specifically for missionaries, as you're preparing to serve a mission, you can't go out with an empty filing cabinet. It's important to have something to draw from.
And, when I was writing my CS responses, that's exactly what the Spirit was doing. He was bringing things that I had already read and that I had already filed away.
And even if you don't remember all of it, it's
I would just remember phrases
I know where it is.
that I could Google and just pull it right up. And because it was something that I had already had in that file bank. And that's literally all it was. I would pray for assistance. I'd be like, help me to find this. And it would pop right up. Because
if you're really good, you'll have a computer.
Instantly, I'd be like, this is where But, that's exactly how it was. If I would be struggling to find something and I couldn't find it anywhere, I'd say a quick prayer. And then the phrase that I needed would just pop right into my head. I'd be able to pull it right up from that.
I want to augment something you said with Joseph Smith, which is always a good thing. I don't enjoy engagement quite the way you do, the same way.
I don't know.
I know.
So when you're a pirate, and you're on the high seas and you see a ship that has fewer cannons, you must engage.
But I do think it's really important to read stuff that we suspect will disagree with us.
Yes.
Joseph Smith gave a statement that's not very well known.
Now, wait a minute. You're countering centuries of culture that say don't read anti. Maybe
no, I'm not saying don't read anti, but I mean, I read Catholics, I read Jews, I read atheists, I read Protestants and evangelicals.
So everything doesn't come from Deseret Book? Your entire PhD wasn't
from Deseret Book.
Wasn't procured from reading Deseret Book?
Joseph Smith gave this statement that most people haven't heard, even though it inspired the fantastic Richard Bushman biography. But he says, I am like a huge rough stone rolling down from a high mountain, and the only polishing I get is when some corner gets rubbed off by coming in contact with something else. Polishing, that is growth, progression, maturity, comes through contact, through encounter.
Yep.
And if we're living in a bubble, we're not encountering any of that stuff, and we're not being polished.
Can I push it even a tiny bit farther? Yeah. The cultural tendency in our church, especially among women, it just is to defer from anything that's going to remotely look like contention. But you can have conversations with somebody who's very different from you without being contentious, even though you might be contending for the truth.
And let me give you a quick practice point that'll make it a little bit more comfortable for somebody who doesn't have a lot of knowledge. For example, maybe you don't have a deep grounding in the scriptures. Learn from the person. Go talk to somebody who disagrees with you and start saying, what do you believe? Well, I don't know what I believe about that. That's interesting. Tell me more. Start engaging with them from that perspective. You do not have to be an expert on LDS or any theology or any history or any doctrine. You've got to engage with people, though, because as they talk, you can go, look, that's a tool. In fact, some of the missionaries say, well, how did you learn what you know? Which isn't much. But how do you learn what you know? And the way that I've done it is by engaging with people who disagree with me, because they raise an issue. I'm like, I don't know what that is. And so I will ask them everything they know about it. And not only will I go check it against our own doctrine and our own history and what our leaders say about it, but I will also check it against the authorities, the sources that they would pull from to get those ideas and say, that guy didn't even understand it correctly. So I don't want to straw man what he said by saying he's the authority, which is a big problem that I think some evangelicals have, and I would caution them against it. The idea that I talked to some Latter-day Saints,
Yeah.
and they told me is no basis for an
But he had the
authorized
title elder.
But he was a bishop, and
He was an elders quorum president,
and that's the idea, is that I think that too many members, especially when they do get a leadership position, they don't realize that the function of the administrative position is just that, it's an administrator. You're not supposed to be the scholar, and Ben's talked about this a lot. You are not the authoritative person to talk on all issues, and you don't have to be. You can say, look, I appreciate your concern. Yes, that historical issue, or yes, that doctrinal issue, but I need to research that myself. Let's go do that together and come back together.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that.
Be the 3-year-old.
Yep.
What's that?
Yeah.
Why? How do you know?
Can I give
Why?
just a very brief anecdotal example to illustrate this? It was on my mission, so hopefully any missionaries doing this or return missionaries, right, can take some heart. So one of the proudest things I did in my mission was I kind of tricked a senior couple to buy me the Jewish Study Bible. So what happened was my companion and I went to a Barnes & Noble on a P-Day one day, and I saw it was there. And I was like, oh, man, this looks really interesting, right? I want to check it out. For those of you who don't know, the Jewish Study Bible, it's a great Bible.
It's fantastic.
It's the Tanakh, so it's just the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, but it's filled with notes, commentary, discussions by different scholars, context. It's very, very good.
Lots of context.
To be clear, it's Jewish.
Yeah.
So when you get to, say, Isaiah 53,
it has different.
and that's
don't expect
exactly
them
it.
to say, oh, well, this is obviously Jesus.
Yeah, obviously Jesus.
So, that's exactly where I'm going with my story. So, long story short, I wanted a copy. I thought it'd be fun to study during personal study. And I somehow convinced the senior couple to buy it for me. And I remember when they gave it to me, they said, Elder, is this approved missionary reading? And my response was, of course it is. It's the Bible. So, but what I did is I devoured that of my mission during my personal study. And what I found was I was coming in contact with interpretations of the Old Testament that very, very differently from what I was expected to believe or what I'd been taught in seminary or whatever, right? And so that was challenging to come across interpretations and very thoughtful, considered interpretations that challenged my beliefs. But at the same time, I was finding, oh my gosh, there are wonderful, excellent scholars out there who say a lot of things that agree with what I believe, right? Like my love for this concept of the divine counsel in the Hebrew Bible, like that is plain.
They do not shy away
they don't shy away from it. And they will say, these passages talk about a divine counsel of a plurality of divinities. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, Paul Great Price and da-da-da. So my punchline is to give an endorsement to what Ben and Travis are saying. It will sometimes be challenging when you come in contact with opinions or beliefs or scholarship that disagrees with what you believe, but it can also be very enlightening and even exhilarating, right? When I come across thinking, oh my gosh, the scholar has these awesome ideas or theories that jive really well with what I believe. Let's explore them more. And that gives you confidence. That gives you something to sink your teeth into to explore further. So
and that can be an interesting conversation when you are engaging with other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The same scholars produced a Jewish annotated New Testament, which is Jewish scholars reading the New Testament,
from
providing
a
Jewish background for Jewish readers who might be threatened by picking up, you know, like an NIV study Bible or find the King James.
Well, and a good book that you've actually recommended is The Bible With and Without Jesus by A.J. Levine, where her and Mark Zvi Bretler kind of go passage by passage and kind of go through the biblical text. Because again, Israelites, Jews would study the New Testament because it is written by Jews, and it's the scriptures. It's not scriptures to them, but it's historical. These are historical texts and documents that reflect some of the beliefs of Jews in the first century.
They're heretical Jews.
Yeah, they may be Jews. Well, but even with that, with the Pharisees that are arguing with Jesus, I mean, you get this idea of it was common. But I think that it's really important to not be afraid of a scholar who's writing a text. Right. I mean, obviously there's garbage out there. If somebody says, you know, the reasons that Mormons believe in a different Jesus or something, maybe peruse the table of contents and put it down. But there are texts that go into a much more scholarly approach to that. And I think it's important. So for example, you raised the question of a different Jesus. We have a more, as you said, Old Testament understanding of God and how there's deities, and that God and the Father and the Son, our understanding of the Godhead is very different, and it comes out of that tradition and is more developmental through the New Testament into today's, whereas as they're looking at it from a Protestant lens or an early Christian lens, looking back into the text rather than out of the text. And I think that it's important to find those overlaps.
The best insult, or not insult, the best criticism I've ever heard about Mormon theology. It came from G.K. Chesterton, who said, Mormon God is too much like the Old Testament God.
Right.
I'll take it.
I'll take it. I'll 100% take that. That's my favorite G.K. Chesterton quote.
That's our different
he's too materialistic. He's too tribal. He's too polytheistic. He's like a man in human form. What is this?
Yeah.
It's too much like the Old Testament God, right? It's like, I'll take it. Yeah.
We are too biblical.
What a great